Okay, Nidhi. Oh, whoever it is.
Morning. This is Karen speaking. We're looking forward to hearing you.
Hello, Karen. Hi. It's afternoon in Brunei, almost evening, actually.
Oh, wow. Yeah, good evening instead, actually. Yeah, that's true. Okay, go ahead, Nidhi.
I'm just going to quickly introduce Salbrina, our lovely speaker for today. Salbrina is a senior assistant professor with research interests in social phonetics, world Englishes, particularly Brunei English, which she will be speaking about today, language policy and planning, and social political linguistics. And she recently published Generation the Usage of English in Brunei. Over to you, Salbrina. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Karen. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In my talk today, I'll be sharing with you my research in Brunei English that I have carried out over the last 2 years, findings which have been or are about to be published. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the changes which have been observed and documented on the English language in Brunei. So this is roughly how the presentation will flow. I'm going to start by giving you a brief introduction on Brunei. Not many people know where Brunei is. I remember as a student in London, when people asked me where I was from, and when I answered Brunei, I would be met with some frowns and confused faces, because quite most of people think that Brunei is in the Middle East. And it was only after I mentioned Singapore, Malaysia, would they nod their heads, indicating that they know which part of the world Brunei is in. Brunei was once the British Protectorate. We achieved our independence from Britain in 1984. It has a small population, the majority of which are Malays, ethnically Malays and Muslims. So this table here shows the linguistic makeup of Brunei. So we have Brunei Malay, which is the language of the majority, and also the nation's lingua franca. There are a variety of minority languages spoken in Brunei, but the state only recognizes 7 as being Brunei's true indigenous languages. The official language is standardized Malay or Bahasa Melayu, which is different from Brunei Malay. At the bottom of the table, you can see that there are 2 varieties of English spoken in Brunei, as identified by Haji Osman and McClellan. And the first is Brunei English, and the second is standardized English. Brunei English, according to Haji Osman and McClellan, is regarded as a second or foreign language by Bruneians, and is also said to be nativizing. It is also said to be the lingua franca for urban Bruneians, but as you shall see by the end of this talk, that is no longer the case, because English is now the lingua franca for a majority of the Bruneians, particularly the young ones. And standardized English, on the other hand, is one that is based on is a normative standard, traditionally the British variety, and it is viewed as a foreign language and used only in formal settings such as education and legal. The presence of English in Brunei can be attributed to its long-standing relationship with the British, dating back to the 19th century. Brunei became a British protectorate in 1888, and in 1906, the British residency was established, and a British resident was installed, and his task was to advise the Brunei Sultan on matters pertaining to governance. Now, use of English began to spread in the country, but was only confined to the upper echelon of the Bruneian society. In 1959, the state constitution was promulgated, which saw the abolishment of the British residential system, and self-government was achieved. Britain, however, was still responsible for defense and foreign policy of Brunei, but all that changed on January 1st, 1984, when Brunei gained full independence and an Islamic Sultanate was proclaimed. In addition to the abolishment of the British residential system, under the 1959 Constitution, Malay was proclaimed Brunei's official language. It was, however, accepted that bills introduced in the Legislative Council should be printed in both Malay and English. but where a dispute arises over the correct interpretation, the Malay text should be followed. So that in a way shows the supremacy of the Malay language over English in official settings. The Malay variety that has been sanctioned as the official language, however, is not the variety that is used for day-to-day communication. Bahasa Melayu, as mentioned earlier, is the standardized variety, and it is markedly different from the vernacular Brunei Malay. One difference lies in the vowel inventory, of which Bahasa Melayu has 6 vowels, while Brunei Malay has 3, R, E, U. The two varieties coexist in a diglossic situation, each having separate functions and occupying 2 distinct domains. Now, moving on to the notion of identity, there is a Malay proverb which perfectly summarizes the intricate relationship between language and identity. It's bahasa jiwa bangsa, or language is the soul of the nation. The Bruneian identity is formed through and by the Malay language, and the language is considered the language of the soul, and one that is reflective of the Bruneian identity is Brunei Malay. However, as we saw earlier, the Malay variety that is propagated by the state is not Brunei Malay, but rather Bahasa Melayu. And Bahasa Melayu is also the variety taught in schools and which students are examined on. Not passing Bahasa Melayu at the exams is a big deal because you usually can't proceed to the next level of education, at least not in government schools. So the history of Brunei's education system has always seen Bahasa Melayu as one of the crucial components. Pre-independence, the schools were streamlined into separate Malay and English mediums, with those educated in the English medium regarded more highly than their Malay educated peers. In 1985, the government implemented the national system of education that utilized both Malay and English. So the bilingual education system, or the Dwi Bahasa as it is known locally, was implemented nationwide. So no longer were the schools streamlined into English or Malay medium. So under this system, initial schooling was conducted entirely in Bahasa Melayu. English was taught as a separate subject. But once pupils entered their 4th year of primary education, English became the language of instruction for most of the subjects, namely maths and science, whereas subjects associated with culture and Islamic religion were delivered in Malay, in Bahasa Melayu. And in 2009, the Ministry of Education rolled out the SPN 21, which is a substantial difference between SPN 21 and the bilingual education system, is in the early introduction of English as the instructional language. In SPN 21, English is used for the teaching of maths, science, and English from 1st year of primary school. So what we're seeing is that the country's education system over the years has progressively become more English heavy. The question now is, how has this greater emphasis on English impacted the linguistic situation in Brunei? So in 1982, Guy Hill wrote that the system of education then was producing Bruneians who spoke English either as a second language or a foreign language. And that those in the latter category, those who speak English as a foreign language, found limited opportunities for higher education. So 40 years ago, English was regarded as a foreign language by many in Brunei, with only a minority speaking English as a second language. Hill went on to make the bold prediction that the medium of instruction would switch from English to Malay entirely. But then the Dwi Bahasa happened, and in 1996, Ozog unveiled his findings on the unplanned use of English in Brunei. So he investigated 6 domains of language use and gathered responses from 570 Brunei citizens. Use of English was extensive among young people, but Brunei Malay was still ranked #1 as language deemed most important. English came in second and Bahasa Melayu third. Now, the home domain was identified as an institution central both to Malay culture and Islam, and one of the least affected by English intrusion. Haji Osman in 2005 noted that a new generation of Bruneians is emerging, those who are making English their own. But how true is this assertion? So I sought to investigate Haji Osman's claim. In 2020, I replicated Ozok's study. So I carried out a survey of 133 participants of different ages. A variety of domains were investigated. The noteworthy findings: number one, age is a determining factor when it comes to language choice. The younger the Bruneians, the greater the tendency to opt for use of English only or bilingual Malay English use. Overall, English supersedes Malay as the preferred code of communication in many of the investigated domains. And in the family domain, while in 1996, it was revealed that the home domain was most resistant to English intrusion, the 2020 findings revealed that English has now seeped into this domain and is the most popular choice for the young Bruneians, especially when interacting with siblings and cousins. And unlike the 1996 finding, this time around English is ranked number one as language regarded most important. Brunei Malay came in second. Now, could this shift in language use, language preference, and language attitude be due to the education system? That was what we set out to investigate in 2021 in a survey involving 830 Bruneian Malays. The question that was of main interest was on the language most used for everyday activity, and it shows that the response using Malay English equally is most popular at 46%. So we also wanted to see whether this shift in language preference has to do with the education system. So what we did was we divided the informants into 3 different groups based on the education system they had been in. So those born from 2003 onwards would have had their education under the SPN 21, while those born from 1975 until 2002 would be of the Dewey Bahasa, just like me. I'm the Dewey Bahasa generation. And the ones born before 1975 were categorized as pre-BES, bilingual education system. And the findings was that there is an apparent relationship between the Bruneians' first language preference, and the education system that they had been in. The main observations is that the number of Bruneians who claim to have Brunei Malay as their first language decreases with each education generation, while the number of English as a first language speakers sees a slight increase. And the number of English inclined Bruneians, that is those who prefer communicating in English, increases with decreasing generational age. And the number of Malay English bilingual Bruneians increases considerably following the implementation of the bilingual education system. So the next stage of the investigation entailed looking at the linguistic practices of Gen Z Bruneians, those born after 1997. Why Gen Z? Because they were also the SPN 21 generation. Our survey looked at the language use in different settings, and also does their self-assessed language attainments, language beliefs, and attitudes. 295 informants took part in the survey. And with regard to language use and preference, the overall patterns is similar to the previous findings. Most popular response was dual Malay English use, indicated by the green segment of the pie chart there. But unlike the previous findings, I found that the Gen Z, the number of those who responded English only is slightly higher at 27% than those who responded Brunei Malay only, which was at 26%. Now, admittedly, this may not be a precise comparison practice, but the findings do nevertheless give a fair representation of the linguistic scene that is unfolding in modern Brunei among young Bruneians. to evaluate the place of English in relation to Brunei Malay and Bahasa Melayu, a self-reported proficiency was carried out based on the 4 skills of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, but I'll only be reporting on the findings on speaking because the responses are of the same patterns for the other skills. So what we see is that for speaking, English surpassed Brunei Malay and Standard Malay, Bahasa Melayu. So this is the same for all the other skills. So English was regarded as their most proficient language when it comes to writing, listening, speaking. Another section of the survey presented a list of 20 statements for which the respondents were to indicate their degree of agreement or disagreement. What can be summed up from the findings in this section is that Brunei's social linguistic ecology appears to be a balancing act involving the 3 codes. Each of them is accorded distinct roles and exerts different degrees of importance. While English is pertinent to modernization and internationalization, Brunei Malay is the language of the home. However, this is admittedly being challenged by English, with the increasing preference for English usage with siblings and same relatives. So that brings us to the next question. Does the predisposition towards English among the youngsters have an impact on the sense of national identity? Well, when asked about identity, more than half, that is 65.8%, of the 295 respondents believe that English is one of the ingredients of the Bruneian identity. So it appears that to the modern young Bruneians, English is now included in the definition of Bruneianness. That English is seen as a component of the Bruneian identity is an unusual development, given that the vast literature discussing the traditional Bruneian identity English was hardly ever mentioned as one of the components. So this is certainly a new development. And a few other questions were also asked in the survey, such as their perception of the importance of the languages. And in contrast to the 1996 study, in which Brunei Malay was ranked #1, for the Gen Z and to the Gen Z Bruneians, English is the most important language. And to the Gen Z Bruneians, using English comes naturally, and the majority of them claim that it is easier to express their thoughts and feelings in English rather than in Brunei Malay. So let's have a look at what we mean by Brunei English, because they seem to associate Brunei English with the Bruneian identity. The first comprehensive linguistic coverage of English in Brunei came in the form of a monograph by Destin and Salbrina in 2013. Among the findings reported in this book is that there are shared features with Singapore and Malaysian Englishes, such as in the lack of distinction between the tense and lax vowels. And there's also a tendency for Bruneians to pronounce things as they are spelled. But one inherently unique Bruneian feature, unique in the sense that it is unlike its sister post-colonial varieties of Singapore and Malaysia. Brunei English is rhotic. And this rhotic nature of Brunei English is confirmed in other studies. The initial supposition that this rhoticity is due to American English was debunked because a few other studies looked at other instances of American English features, such as T voicing, the lot vowel, and they were not confirmed because the lot vowel was mostly rounded amongst Bruneians, and the bath vowel was back and that's most centralized, but definitely not a front vowel. So, but then over the last couple of years, there has been an increase in claims of American English influencing the English pronunciation of young Bruneians. What amused me the most was the time when I delivered a virtual lecture to a bunch of university students from America, from George Mason University. And during the presentation, I accidentally pressed the play button to a recording of 3 Bruneian girls in mid-conversation. And the American students initially thought that one of them had forgotten to mute their mics. And during the discussion at the end of the talk, some of the students relayed their astonishment at how American-like the Bruneian females sounded. So what I did was I set out to investigate whether the sounds of contemporary Bruneian English have indeed undergone Americanization. And
Salbrina,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we need to wind up because we need to move room for our next presentation.
Oh, so sorry about that.
That's okay, don't worry. So if you can wrap up, that would be fantastic.
Okay, sorry. Okay, but basically what we found is that Brunei English is indeed undergoing Americanization, but it is not.
She asked for some medicine. She asked for some medicine. She asked for some medicine.
These are some of the recordings of the vowel in asked, the mouth vowel. So, so the conclusion that I could derive from this is that even though we initially thought that it sounded American, it's not exactly American. It was a quality that is near open central and open mid-front vowel. Okay, and similar findings for lot there. So what I think is happening is that Americanization is just one of the processes which Brunei English is undergoing towards stabilization. So it's a lot of different processes at play. And I mentioned in my paper smartness, localization, spelling, pronunciation, and Americanization. When two or more forces are at play, then the change happens at a much rapid pace. So, okay, these are just some instances of the Americanization in my diagram.
To the city. To the city. The advertisement. Hurry up. Hurry up. Tomatoes. Tomatoes.
And this is the latest paper that I worked on, and we were looking at the notion of identity. And this is the recording that I accidentally played to the George Mason University students.
Oh my God, the entire time when something happens, I'll be like,
Yo, Trish, you like this?
that's your movies? That's your movies?
When the credits start rolling, yo.
Oh my God.
Is it sad?
This is your today. You said it was sad.
I need
Why are you changing your word? Why are you changing your word? Stop it. Shut up. Oh my God, the entire
So among the main findings of that study is that language alternation is rife, with English making up the bulk of the lexical items. 3 languages were utilized during the conversation: English, Malay, and Arabic. So they each signal different aspects of identity. The fluidity of language alternation in the conversation signals hybridity of the young Bruneians' cultural and social identities. And there are features of localization indicative of an emerging Bruneian English, a Bruneian variety of English. So that brings me to the end of my slides. Sorry for having to rush through everything. But what's next on the agenda? So we are hoping to actually identify whether there is indeed such a thing as a Brunei English accent, whether it is a dialect in its own right, and also whether there are variations within the Brunei English variety. And we also would like to have a look at Brunei English within the world in English paradigm, and as Professor David actually mentioned earlier on about the complex dynamic systems, that is what we intend to do with Brunei English, because of a lot of the processes that are happening in shaping Brunei English. So it's moving away from British English, but not so much towards American English as initially thought. It's actually developing its own colors and its own flavor. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salbrina. I think we have enough time for just one question, sadly, right now. Okay.
Thank you, Sabrina. I'm Rita here. I'm Chinese, and working on my PhD in language policy in a Chinese tertiary education context. Thank you for the informative talk, and I was quite interested in the education system you introduced in the first couple of slides, especially you mentioned some of the schools, you have the English as minimum instruction or bilingual as a language policy. I wonder how different levels of English education will affect students' language identity in the context, or how later when you do the survey about the Z generation, how their education system or their models of education affect their identity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. An excellent one indeed. Actually, the is a nationwide. The language education system in Brunei is nationwide. So all the schools. So when Brunei introduced the bilingual education system, it was all the schools in Brunei had the bilingual education system in 1985 until 2008, and then 2009 they switched to the more English-centric SPN 21. So at the moment, when we thought previously when we talked about Brunei English, they mentioned that there would be differences along the social climb, social educational climb. However, with the education system being uniform, what we see at the moment now is that even the rural areas, which used to be Malay dominated, we see English seeping, and the youngsters particularly using English. So it's like my colleagues don't seem to agree with me, but my findings have proven that. And then the youngsters in Brunei, like for instance, my nephews, my nieces, and when they talk amongst themselves, they do not use Malay at all. They use English. And even my nephew, I've got two nephews actually, who passed their English O-level examination with flying colors, but failed their Malay. And then they don't know certain sort of Malay words. And then people say that, oh, it's because of your socio-economic status, because of your university and your system. But that's not the case, because when I go out and then I go to the rural areas, the clinics, and then I hear kids talk using English, and then the mother would try to use English with them, but the mother's English would be, all over the place, so to speak. So what we see now is that it is going towards, what is it now? English seems to be like part and parcel of the everyday language communication system in Brunei. And with regard to identity, the one that I didn't get to talk about is that when they talk about English being part of the Brunei identity, they are not exactly referring to English as it is in regards to British English or American English. They are talking about Brunei English, our own brand of English, with all the Malay particles like la, bah, and wah, and like the features of localization, like ter-click. Ter-click means accidentally clicked, or ter-stuck, accidentally stuck. So our communication has a lot of those sort of features. So I think when they say that English is part of the Brunei identity, they are actually referring to our own brand of English variety. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Salbrina, we have just one small question that popped into the chat. Leah has asked, where can we find the survey instrument used in your study?
I actually included in my paper. If you are interested in getting a hold of my paper, I know it's not open access. So if you can email me and I can share with you the article, and the survey is included as an appendix to the paper.
Thank you, Salbrina. I think that's about as much time we have for this presentation. Thank you so much for being here and presenting about Brunei English to us. Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. So sorry about the time.
And we will see our virtual audience.